Good afternoon. So how many of you have heard me speak before? Can I just see a show of hands? A few of you? Excellent. All right, got it. So I'm going to run through a little bit of a wrap-up of what you've seen over the last 2 days, and then focus a little bit more on the model that we've been working on. How do you deal and how do you react as an organization in this new world? You heard a little bit about my background. I'm actually Canadian, originally from India. I spent 10 years in Europe restructuring large European companies, mostly French ones, which is why I'm bald, and I think many of you will understand that. And the last 15 years I've been in the US. And I spent 2 years, as was mentioned, as the head of innovation at Yahoo. And I found that when you try disruptive innovation in any large organization, the immune system will come and attack you. Right? John Hagels calls them the antibodies. All of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk. And yet now that's the higher order bit. And how do we deal with that is maybe the most interesting question in the world today. Every large organization is dealing with this problem today. And so maybe the strangest phone call I've received was a few months ago from the Vatican saying the Pope has the oldest immune system in the world. As he tries to update that organization, he's got some interesting challenges. So I'm flying there tonight for a second and third meeting with those folks. So overall, there's some interesting times going on. At Singularity, I'm the founding executive director. As of a month ago, I actually joined the board of XPRIZE. So I'm on the board with some very interesting people. I'm helping Peter and Marcus build out the XPRIZE vision as a sister organization to Singularity. There is a lot of key tensions and key questions that you're all dealing with. You know, how do you deal with this physical versus virtual world? How do you deal with the kind of the digitization? How do you juxtapose that with our existing organizations? And most importantly, how do you organize for this? How do you adapt your organizations to this world? You've seen this kind of diagram to death, hopefully, this challenge of how do we, our cognitive ability to spot this exponential change is very bad. We're very bad at this particular pattern. My favorite joke around this is the phrase exponential growth is actually growing exponentially. Right? So there's a little fun way of thinking about it. When we apply this to industries, we tend to think of things in 3 layers. The vast majority of our history has been very physicalized products. All of the revenue and business models comes from the sheer physicality of the world. We extract raw resources, we assemble raw materials, we ship them around, and all of the money and business models and revenue came from that. Then we added a layer where the product was physical, like your Kindle or iPhone, but all the revenue is information-based and digitally driven. With the rise of mobile and internet, we now have complete industries that are completely digital with no physical manifestation at all. The music business is an easy example. And we're seeing industries rise up through that ranks, right? It used to look like this, but now we're kind of seeing this whole thing flip around in a very different way. I write in the book that the Tesla is not really a car with computers and sensors in it. It's really a computer with wheels. And you think of it very differently when you look at it that way. Actually, one of our alumni corrected me and said, you're wrong about that. Remember that it updates itself every 2 or 3 weeks. You have to think of it as an app that has wheels, and that really breaks your brain in terms of how that works. But you can see the analogy around that. There's 4 kind of major topics that we see happening today in the world. Very obviously, the first is we're digitizing the world very rapidly. Our memories aren't in our heads anymore, they're in our smartphones. All our relationships are digital because of social media as opposed to analog. And you've seen all of the disruption of this last couple of days. The best way I found of framing this is photography. You know, some of you are old enough to remember film photography. You're operating on a scarcity basis and you're operating on a material substrate. Okay? So you can only carry so much film. It costs about €1 a photograph. It takes a few days to get your prints back. When you move to digital photography and you move to the information-based environment, 3 fundamentally important things happen. First, marginal cost goes to 0. Right? I can now take 1,000 photographs. The cost stays the same. As a result of that, the domain completely explodes. In film photography, I'm carefully clicking here, I'm carefully clicking there. In digital photography, we're holding the button down on all of our devices and taking billions of times more photographs. The third thing that happens is very subtle, but very important from a business perspective, is you shift the problem space. Okay? So in a scarcity problem space, I may publish books on photography, I may offer courses on how to do composition, I may try and sell very high-end cameras. In a digital abundance problem space, we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 devices, and you can't find anything. Right? And when you shift the problem space, the business model changes. Nobody can make money offering courses on composition or publishing books on photography. And so the challenge we have today is many of our industries, we're optimized for this material scarcity-based world, and the world is shifting very radically away from us. And how we deal with that is maybe the biggest challenge facing our business leadership world today. And we're seeing this transition in all of these technologies, and you've seen this now. Energy, biology, transportation, food even is becoming more and more digital as we start to kind of information enable all of it. One way I like to frame this is kind of the pattern of the cost curve. This is a 700-year pattern going from 1300 to today of the cost of light. And most interesting, look at the shape of the curve. Really expensive plateaus for a while and then literally crashes to almost zero, and we barely notice how much it costs us to light up a room today. Well, here's the graph of DNA sequencing, and you can see a very similar shape. Right? Expensive plateaus for a while and then literally crashes to zero. Here's solar modules, as Ramez talked about, very, very similar shape. And all of these technologies are going through this pattern. The cost is crashing to zero as we go to this information-based environment. And this is a fundamentally fascinating area today. We see, you heard from Ramez, how quickly solar energy is exploding. 25% of the farms in California are now solar powered. And my favorite one is this one. The Kentucky Coal Museum is using solar panels to power the thing, which I thought was the fabulous irony around this, right? And so this becomes really surreal to kind of see how this kind of works. And you can see, you know, each of these technologies is doubling on its own, but where they intersect, you add a whole other multiplier to the equation. And I actually tried to live this. Last year, a few months ago, I took my Tesla, and I drove from Miami to Toronto. I would get on the highway, I would hit the autonomous car mode, the car drove itself. It was like having a private train. And because the charging stations are free, the entire trip cost me zero. Right? I had my assistant stack up like 60 conference calls along the way. We drove back down, we came back down to Miami a few weeks ago, and I said to my wife, "You fly, I'll take the car." This was way more fun. Right? And so really interesting to see how this happens. And the fact that I could go 2,500 kilometers and not pay a dime was really fascinating. That's a Gutenberg moment. Right? We're all familiar with the printing press in the 15th century. That one event changed everything. Today we have about 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us at the same time. You know, just autonomous cars changes everything. Then you have drones, then you have solar energy, then you have CRISPR, then you have Bitcoin. We are entering this magical world of incredible kind of innovation hitting us. The big challenge, though, the technologies are all great. They're all very sexy. But from a social perspective, we are not set up to absorb this pace of change. In fact, I will argue that every mechanism that we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, our healthcare systems, intellectual property, education, you name it, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago. Not for a trillion sensors coming down the pipe. And we have a very fundamental issue here. We actually have to re-architect every single basic mechanism by which we run the world. And our current leadership can't do it. I'll give you two easy examples. You take democracy. We invented representative democracies 200-300 years ago when information was scarce. If you were in Washington, D.C., you had no idea what was happening in California. The speed of a horse was as fast as you could find out. So you had a representative come and say, here's what my people are thinking. Today we have an abundance of information that can get misused, misrepresented, faked, and every major democracy in the world is broken. India broken, Brazil is broken, the UK broke last year, the US is breaking in front of our eyes. Right? And so democracies do not work in an abundance of information. So how do we deal with that? And so how do we update that? And if you look at our political leaders, they're stuck in that model. They can't get out of it. They're all stuck assuming a predictable, stable, linear status quo world, and we're entering kind of Black Swan Central over here. And so huge challenges on that side. Or on a slightly lighter note, you take the concept or the institution of marriage. We invented marriage about 15,000 years ago, and at the time, average lifespan was about 25. So you got married, you had kids, you died. It was not designed to last 50, 60 years. You know, that's state-sanctioned torture is what that is, right? I mean, this is not, and so this is going to present huge challenges as to how do you update that institution, right? And if anything Andrew talks about comes true, then we'll double human lifespan very quickly. Are you supposed to live with the same person for 100 years? That's crazy. So how do we deal with that? And so all of these institutions now are really challenged around this. Right? By the way, I got permission from my wife to say that, so it's okay. And so our social structures are not going to make it. In fact, we're seeing the rise of fundamentalism globally because people in every ideology, Hindu nationalists, Muslim radicals, Jewish settlers, Christian evangelicals, are all saying, I can't take this pace of change. Let's go back to an older time when things were better. But it's a fallacy. As we know, we're in a much better place than we've ever had it. But because our leadership globally cannot articulate a positive future because of what's coming, because they don't know about it, we end up back in the politics of fear. And any political leader is selling the fact that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and as you can see, we think totally the opposite. And so how do we deal with that challenge, and maybe the biggest one? From an economic perspective, there's a couple of key things happening. The first, most new business models are information-based, right? The biggest companies in the world today are all technology, information-driven companies. The second is the volatility is accelerating. It used to take 20 years to create a billion-dollar marketplace. We're seeing that happen now in months. But this is the one that I find most interesting. This is the graph of newspaper revenues, which kind of trundle upwards, and then you had the internet really bite, and you had a 6x drop in revenues within 2 years as eBay, Craigslist really started to bite. We saw the same cliff hit the music business fairly soon afterwards, about a 10x drop in that industry. Note that it's called the media industry. They're trying to sell the physical media. But actually, it's an information service. When I can go from artist to listener with a YouTube video, all the intermediaries disappear, right? This cliff is hitting the TV business right now. You might be aware that media buying is catching up to the fact that nobody's watching ads. I predict that cliff will hit the car industry in about 5 to 7 years. In about 5 to 7 years, it will not make sense to own a car. Already in Silicon Valley today, nobody buys a second car. They use Uber to get around. And so we're going to see some interesting cliff-type effects happen in more and more industries as we take this bite. And it really speaks to how hard this is to spot. Our brains cognitively, as I said, are really bad. And we have a lot of great examples of how this works. When the Google car first came out 8 years ago, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the sensors, the radar added up to about $200,000 a car. And all the car companies said, oh, cute research project, but you'll never commercialize that. 2 years later, $50,000 a car. 2 years later, $25,000 a car. You may be aware it's now less than $1,000 a car for all the sensors, right? That LiDAR unit at the top of that Prius cost $75,000 5 years ago. The equivalent is $50 today. The next generation is $10, and it will look like that. So we're literally, we've seen this with our GPS systems, literally dematerializing in front of our eyes, and we don't even notice them in our smartphones. We talked today about the connected car. Well, I don't need a connected car. I just need a slot to put my phone in, right, which is what many people are looking at today. So this challenge is a big one because it's hard to see that. And all of the experts in that industry have a tough time with this. This is a fascinating prediction that Ericsson made. They made this prediction in 2010 that we would have 50 billion internet-connected devices by the end of the decade. At the time, there was about 600 million internet-connected devices. Well, I talked to Ericsson a few months ago, and they said we were wrong about our prediction. Our new prediction is 500 billion by the end of the decade. And something that we see very consistently across these domains is when you have a domain that's growing exponentially, the experts in that domain are wrong by about 10x. So this is not a math error, this is a cognitive error, because the models we're using are out of date. And they're old, backward-looking and linear, and yet the world is growing exponentially. Let me give you one more example to really make this point home. In 2003, the leading expert in solar energy in the world said this. He said the cost of the silver, the glass, the wiring means we will never drop below $1 a watt. Okay? You can see the market actually believed him for a little bit. Then it started to drop, kept dropping. If you saw Ramez's charts, we're down to about 18 cents a watt today. And his latest comment is here at the bottom where he says, okay, it has exceeded my expectations, right? And we're fond of saying an expert will tell you how you cannot do something. And all of our companies are filled with deep expertise of 20 years, 30 years in that one domain. And the world is radically shifting. So how do we deal with this? And you heard John talk about the fact that we should take people to the edge and build off the edge, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this pace of change is hard to spot. And the reason that it's unstoppable and inexorable today is the sheer democratization of all of these technologies. As the cost goes to zero, you get this kind of pattern going. A domain becomes digital, you get open source communities forming, and then you get radical disruption of the status quo. Whether it's drones or Bitcoin or biotech or neuroscience, all of these technologies are going through this pattern. And the aggregate effects, again, become very, very profound. This was a cute story a few years ago. Eric Mazukovsky tried to raise some money for his Pebble watch. nobody would fund him. In Silicon Valley, we're very biased towards software. He put it on Kickstarter as a desperate attempt to try and raise $100,000, ended up raising $10 million, okay? And 2 years later, he was outselling Samsung in Best Buy. So here's a kid with zero experience in consumer electronics, put something up on Kickstarter, and in 2 years is beating the world's biggest electronics company. That's what's possible today. Today, any entrepreneur can enter a legacy industry with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and totally disrupt it. Elon Musk may be the best example. He has no experience in the space sector, energy sector, car sector, and yet he's created market leaders in all of them. And his formula is really simple. He looks out 10 years at an accelerating technology, builds a company to intercept it 10 years out. And if you do that, then you intercept the cost curves and the price performance quite fascinatingly. The really interesting part about Kickstarter, by the way, is not the fact that you can raise money. It's the fact that you can get market validation for a product without building it. We have never been able to do that before in the history of business. But now you can get market validation without building it. Sony Corporation, which has not been terribly successful recently, is now launching anonymous Kickstarter campaigns, seeing what works and then funding that. Completely changes product development. You don't need focus groups, you don't need market research, you can get rid of all of that and just do this, especially for consumer-focused products. Then you've got things like the Hyperloop. How many of you are familiar with the Hyperloop? Hopefully many of you here, great. Fascinating to see this concept pull out where he wants to repurpose oil pipelines and shoot people down. I was actually chatting with Elon about this, and I said, Elon, if you try and accelerate somebody from 0 to 6,000 kilometers an hour and then decelerate them, you'll probably kill them. I have a degree in theoretical physics. That's what my numbers tell me. And his answer was, yeah, it's an issue. Right? And there you see the mindset of a great entrepreneur. I'm thinking, I'm the expert, right? That looks totally impossible to me. And he's like, yeah, we have to solve that problem. I was half right. You have to slow down a little bit. But the concept holds, and it's still pretty powerful. Because this pace of change is not slowing down, right? It's actually accelerating. The broader aggregate numbers are very, very profound. We had 1 billion people online in 2010. We just crossed 3.8 billion people. It may have come up already, but we now have more than 50% of global population online. But by the end of the decade, most of the population will be online. Okay? In this next few years, 3 billion new minds, the biggest marketplace in the history of mankind, is getting created right now. And the single question you should be asking in your companies is, are our products and services ready to take advantage of this market? Trillions of dollars will come into the new economy as we lift all of these people into connectivity. They're all going to have a tablet. The cheapest Android tablets, that's a 1 gig Android tablet with Bluetooth camera, Wi-Fi, and it's a phone. The manufacturing cost of that is now below $7. And it's dropping 50% a year. So by the time we get to 2020, we're giving that thing out in cereal boxes because you won't be able to sell anything to those 6 billion people. Right? And there's about 7 competing technologies to deliver broadband globally. You have the Google Loon project, you have the Facebook drone project, Airbus has its solar plane project. This Israeli company wants to deliver gigabyte broadband from space within a few years. And once we see 6 or 7 technologies competing, we know one of them is going to succeed. So the world that we're living into is 6 billion people online within the next few years with the device and with broadband. And the world fundamentally changes at that point. Now, the big question then becomes, how do you react to this? How do you deal with this pace of change? You can see the disruption on the outside. We're also seeing fascinating disruption in all of our internal lines of business. Right? Sales and marketing is almost completely digital today. There's almost no physical manifestation left to it. But this quote from David Rose is the one that really got me. One of our faculty made the comment that all of our organizations are built for predictability and efficiency, as John Hagel calls it, scalable efficiency. Right? We are architected to kind of build a widget, supply it to 100 countries with back-end ERP systems and SAP software and supply chain standardized, et cetera, et cetera. Our organizations are not architected for flexibility or adaptability. And yet that's now the high order bit. And how do you deal with that is the basic idea. The idea behind the book is we've learned how to scale technology pretty well. We can go from 0 to 1 million users quite easily, but building the actual organization is painfully incremental and linear, as many of you are very aware. But in the last few years, we're seeing a new breed of organization being created that is operating in a completely different basis. And I call these exponential organizations. The minimum benchmark, the definition, is they're delivering a minimum 10x better, faster, cheaper than their competitors. And so if you can deliver 10x better than your peers in the same space, you get this qualification. Our index right now has about 100 such organizations operating in it, operating in this very new way. So half of the book is analyzing that, saying, how are they doing it? What techniques and tips are they using to scale so quickly? The second half is prescriptive, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll give you two examples. One of them is TED. 10 years ago, TED is a nice conference with about 1,000 people a year. Chris Anderson takes it over, and he does three things. He establishes a huge purpose, ideas worth spreading, gives away all the TED Talks for free, and then lets anybody go create a TEDx event. And in 10 years, he's created a global media brand. Okay, nobody has ever created a global media brand that fast, and his cost of doing so is literally zero. So we have this possibility today to take an existing environment, apply a set of techniques, and blow it open to a global level. Okay? In a more traditional industry is Local Motors. How many of you are familiar with Local Motors? Right? Excellent. Local Motors is a car company that uses a social network of about 100,000 car mechanics, auto enthusiasts to deliver and build and design their cars. The numbers are staggering. A typical car company costs about $3 billion to design a new car from scratch. Right? Local Motors can design an entire car from zero for $3 million. That's 1,000 times better than the status quo. Typical car has 25,000 parts. Theirs has 50. Typical car takes about 1,000 man-hours to put together. Theirs takes 1. And a typical car factory is about 1 million square feet, and theirs can be built literally on the side of this stage. So here you have 4 metrics where they're beating the status quo by multiple orders of magnitude each. How the hell do you compete with that? And the answer is you don't. You have 3 options. Number 1, you buy them, you shut them down, which was what we've done traditionally with big companies trying to do this. Visa in the payment space is famous for this, et cetera, et cetera. Option 2, lobby the government and draft legislation and lobby them out of existence. So that's the regulatory capture. That's option 2. But as the world is moving faster, that becomes harder to do. You look at Uber. Uber is successful by deliberately breaking the law, leapfrogging the public acceptance, and waiting for policy to catch up. Right? And so that's not that viable. Option 3 is invest in them, partner with them, learn from them, buy them, steal from them, whatever. Figure out what they're doing and bring it back in. And that's the option that we're seeing people. Many of you are partnering with startups in your spaces to understand how they're operating, because this is a completely different paradigm. And anybody growing up in a traditional industry looks at this and says, that's just not possible. There's a cognitive dissonance that we have to deal with. So there's 3 components that go into building an exponential organization. The first is all of them have what I call a massive transformative purpose. It's a high-order tagline with a social purpose built in, creates a North Star for the organization. Google organized the world's information. TED is ideas worth spreading. Singularity's go impact 1 billion people, et cetera, et cetera. We're now starting to see brands morph into this. Here's Coca-Cola's recent mantra, open happiness. 2 years ago, Paul Pullman read the book, and he's the CEO of Unilever. He ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP. And as of 2 months ago, the 5 best performing brands in Unilever are the ones that have done this the most. So we're starting to see the model bite. I was with the CEO of Gucci 2 weeks ago, and he gave me a great quote. He said, I will turn Gucci into an exponential organization. So all of these have this big, massive transformative purpose. The second component is 5 externalities that allow you to keep a very small resource footprint and use 1 or more of these to scale very quickly. Uber doesn't hire its own staff. TED uses community. Google is using algorithms. Airbnb is leveraging other people's bedrooms. And then you have digital engagement, gamification, incentive prizes, et cetera, et cetera. Think about Uber. The mission-critical function in Uber, which is to match driver and passenger, doesn't happen inside the organization. It happens out in the wild. And by enabling that with technology, you can scale infinitely. Right? And so some fascinating things possible when you can do this. The second component is 5 internal mechanisms that we use to drive culture and kind of manage the control framework. Interfaces between the core organization and what's on the outside. Uber has very customized ways of dealing with its drivers. Real-time dashboards. I have a section in the book called Death to the 5-year plan. Okay? Because by the time you've finished your 5-year plan, the plan is out of date. Right? We know this. And yet we're stuck doing it from a legacy perspective. So what we're seeing companies do today is they have an MTP and a one-year operating plan that updates itself in real time and constantly steers the ship in the right direction. Okay? The third is the whole lean startup methodology, which turns out not to work so well for startups, but it works great if you have existing processes you want to automate. This also thinks about how do you encourage the taking of risk in your organizations. Amazon, for every team in Amazon, is measuring how many experiments did you run this quarter, how many succeeded, how many failed. If you're not running enough experiments and not enough failed, you're not doing well enough because you want to constantly be pushing the boundaries. The last one is all of the horizontal communication patterns like Slack, Yammer, Chatter. We now have very good evidence that horizontal collaboration and peer-to-peer communication is much more valuable than the vertical hierarchical structures we've all grown up with. If you can do that, you actually don't need the vertical organization structure. How many of you are familiar with Valve Software? Right, software company out of Seattle, about 400 people. They have no CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no middle management layers. Each person self-selects as to what they want to do. So if I spot a bug in the software, I grab 3 people, we go fix the bug, we disband. And it sounds like a joke, but they get more revenue per employee than Microsoft by doing this. Okay? And so we're seeing a lot of these exponential organizations apply this. Holacracy is one of the techniques used to embody this. But the poster child of this may be this Chinese appliance manufacturer called Haier. They make 55 million fridges and ovens a year. So it's a big company, 80,000 people. 10 years ago, the CEO looked at his organization, very command and control, top-down structured, and he decided, I cannot meet my corporate goals. And he blew it up, turned 80,000 people into 2,000 autonomous teams of about 40 people each. Each team has a P&L, each team decides whatever they want to do, each team elects their own leader. Now, any of us growing up in the business world thinks that if you're making 55 million fridges a year, you need a ton of product strategy, demand forecasting, supply chain management. Turns out you don't. Who knew? Literally, they've tripled their market cap by doing this. Okay? And literally, this is something it's impossible for us to think about, even especially in Germany, where you have very rigid structures and how do we think. Even worse in France, by the way. They can't get their heads around this at all. Now, not everybody does all of these. But it turns out if you implement 4 out of these 10 characteristics, your organizational improvement increases 10x. So 4 out of the 10 give you a 10x. More the better, but 4 out of the 10 give. So we're advising a lot of companies, which 4 should you implement for your organization? We actually created a diagnostic survey. And by the way, we'll send out the slides. So if you're frantically taking photographs, you can save the trouble. But if you want to try this, you can actually go score. We asked 20 questions like, to what extent do you tolerate failure and risk-taking? If you're level 1, failure is not an option. Okay? Level 2 is, yeah, we say you should tolerate, you should go take risks, but really we don't want you to do that. Number 3, we do it in sandbox innovation areas. And number 4, we measure it across the company. So we ask you 21 questions. We come up with a quantified score on how flexible is your organization. You can do it yourselves. It's free. If you want a really interesting exercise, have your C-suite do it, have your middle management do it, and have the bottom of the company do it, and look at the difference between the scores. Okay? We did this at Singularity, and when the C-suite scored ourselves, we thought we're fabulously exponential. And then when the people at the bottom scored it, they said, no, we're terribly linear at everything we do. So you have this really interesting discussion on it. Last year, we actually went on CNBC with Michiel. Where's Michiel? Michiel is there. He helped score. We went with Yuri and Michiel. We scored the Fortune 100 using this survey. And we actually created an index of the Fortune 100 ranked by how flexible is the organization. Okay? So this is the Fortune 100 ranked by the flexibility of the organization structure. Most interestingly, Hult Business Schools did an academic research project and found that your stock market performance correlates directly with the flexibility of your organization, which makes sense, right? As the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt is going to drive market performance. In fact, we did a further analysis and we found if you had invested in the top 10 most flexible organizations, you would have outperformed the S&P by about 3 times. So we've got a really great index fund. We're going to go score all of the DAX, the CAC 40, the Nikkei, the Hang Seng, score all the companies, and then invest in the top 10. And over time, that should do very well. And so that's our tactic next. That's the make $1 million idea number 35B. in that sense. Now, so the big question then becomes, what do you do if you have an existing organization? And for me, this was the big intellectual challenge, right? It's easy to analyze these companies, but what do you do? And similar to what kind of John Hagel talked about, he's one of my mentors, as you can see. The number one, transform your leadership. Update your leadership that we are in a fundamentally new world. If your leadership, not that them, but the C-suite is not aware and the board is not aware, you have a tough time of it. You know, take a company like BMW. Right? Their tagline is, we're the ultimate driving machine. We're pretty sure nobody's going to be driving, so that's a pretty big tension to navigate if you're that organization, right? Think about that. Every design aesthetic, every engineering protocol, every manufacturing specification in BMW is saying optimize for the driver. And the world is going 180 degrees the other way. So that's an enormous challenge to go do that part. But the second suggestion is maybe the most structural, similar to what John talked about. Do not do a radical business transformation project. Keep running the core organization, do incremental change, but build these edge organizations, exponential organizations on the edge, pointing outward. Larry Page came to me a few years ago and said, hey, your unit at Yahoo was really successful. Should I do that at Google? And I said, no, you'll have the same immune system problem. Do something like it, keep it stealth and point it away. And you see the result with Google X, where they have their core information management capabilities, then they add hardware to the edges, Google Glass, Google Car, et cetera, right? Yeah, they're interested in transportation, but each Google car is collecting a gigabyte of data per second per car. So that's what they're really interested in. So if you move your flower pot on your windowsill, Google will know, right? The NSA already knows, as Mark probably knows, but now the Google will know also. Okay? But the master of this technique is Apple. Apple has created a hyper-successful company, and yeah, they have a great design capability and a great technology supply chain. I will argue that their core innovation is actually organizational. What Apple does, unlike anybody else in the world, is they'll take a small team that's really disruptive, they'll take it to the edge of the organization, they'll keep them completely stealth, and they'll say to them, go disrupt another industry. Right? Nobody does this. So they started with what? Music, and then phones, and then tablets, and now payments, and cars, and watches, and retail, and healthcare. There's literally no limit to their market cap. They can just keep knocking over industry after industry and folding it into the platform play, as you heard earlier. So this is essentially, and as we enter a world where either you're the disruptor or you're disrupted, you have to follow suit. You have to do something like this. And many of you are doing this with your organizations. The big challenge is don't try and bring it back in. If something's successful, spin it out. Okay? And this is an important point that we can talk about. We've already talked about becoming a platform earlier today. There's some great anecdotes, both positive and negative use cases. A positive one is Nestle with Nespresso. So the CEO took a group of people away from the core organization, built out Nespresso, completely different brand delivery model. The CFO was not allowed to defund it. And now we see a radical success. It's now a $5 billion line of business within 4 years for Nespresso. Okay? And fascinating to see there. Maybe the most, RWE, as we've already seen, has taken their company and broken it up into the core and the edge organization. We actually work with them to create an MTP for the InnoG structure. Walmart is maybe the most instructive element here. 10 years ago, Walmart realized that they had to compete with Amazon, that this whole e-commerce thing was not a fad. So they set up a team in Bentonville, their headquarters, and said, we have the best distribution logistics supply chain in the world. Let's go beat Amazon. Within 18 months, the immune system had killed it. Because all the existing managers said, we shouldn't be doing this, we should be optimizing for our own stores. Amazon will never succeed, this internet thing is a fad, et cetera, et cetera. So they did it a second time. The second time they did it, they said to their team, go to the edge of the organization and build yourselves there because we'll mess with you otherwise. But still use our existing supply chain inventory systems. 18 months later, that was dead. So they did it a third time. The third time, they set up away from the edge, and they said to them, go build your own independent supply chain distribution systems. Even though we have the best in the world, go build your own because we keep messing with you. It started to succeed that third time. They pulled it back in too early and killed it. And it was on the fourth iteration, and you think of the careers and the churn and the money and the opportunity cost of all of that. On the fourth time, they did it independently, separately, and only after it achieved its own critical mass did they start stitching the back ends together. But by then, Amazon's gone. Right? And there's literally no MBA program in the world that teaches you this. on how to do this. So this is the big challenge we have today. We are seeing some great success stories. You see Microsoft doing some amazing work transitioning from a software sales to a subscription model. And companies are doing really fascinating things of going to their edge and going to adjacent spaces. Here's a vertical farm. You can see the guy in the middle there. This will feed an entire neighborhood sustainably. Okay? Anybody know which company this is? This is IKEA. Yeah. Okay? Of course, there'll be a ton of extra parts left over when you finish building that thing. It'll be real crazy. Maybe light a fire with those. But you can see here a company going into an adjacent area and really leveraging their core capabilities and aggressively attacking another area. What we're doing today is we've created a 10-week sprint. So 2 years ago, the CIO of Procter & Gamble came along and said, hey, can we apply your ideas inside the company? And I said, sure, but it'll take like this 2.5-year period by the time the company fully wakes up. Let's shrink that to 10 weeks. And so the idea was, can we move the management and culture 2 years ahead in a 10-week process? And we've done it. And we call this an EXO sprint. And we found we can solve the immune system problem in big companies. So this is actually the process I'm trying to run at the Vatican right now. If that works, I'm applying for a Nobel Prize. Like that'll be quite a challenge there. We've now run this 5 times successfully, and we're very, very thrilled with it. So we're partnering with different companies on how to apply this. Singularity helps put these in, and we're running this on a nonstop basis. We've also taken this and applied it to cities. So I have 3 things in my world right now. I've got a private company doing these sprints. We have a public nonprofit where we go into a city and we run this process, and we find we can solve a problem facing a city for about 1/10 the existing cost, right, which is very compelling. So we've run this with Medellin in Colombia, and we're about to start with the mayor of Miami on the future of transportation, because the big challenge in our public sector is the existing policy is the immune system. You know, you try and update education, and the teachers' unions will fight you. You try and update healthcare, and the doctors will fight you. Right? And so you got a huge challenge in updating that. And we find we can actually crack the immune system problem. And so we're actually writing a manual on how to do this. We're going to open source it. So you can essentially download it and run it inside your companies for free. My thesis right now is every one of the global 5,000 has to go through this process, with or without us, because you need to do it in a very dramatic way. So let me pause there. I'll take a couple of questions, and I want to invite Jonathan on stage, who's been through the same process with SAP. Jonathan, come on up. Any questions before we go to a Q&A session? I covered a few different areas there. Everybody's freaked out. Question?
Yes, you were saying you just ran this 5 times?
Yeah.
Can you tell us where?
Procter & Gamble. In fact, they've been so excited, they come on customer calls to do the next ones. We've done it with DEWA, the Dubai Water Authority, with Rossini, which makes ceramic brakes for Mercedes and Teslas and so on. You know, as we get to autonomous cars and software driving, you don't need high-performance brakes. So what's the future of the brake company if they make high-end brakes, right? So interesting challenge. So we've done it 5 times. We're very excited about the results of it.